been listening the last couple of days to you guys and what you've been going through and what Frank's been telling you. And it just comforts me to know that you guys can't say anything about what I'm going to talk about tonight. So that's very encouraging. When I'm done with this, I want to hear a story about a duck. And this duck story has nothing to do with anything why we're here. But this duck story has everything to do with why we're here. I'm telling it for two reasons. You're going to see the vulnerability of us as police officers over something that's just completely silly. And you're also going to see that when that duck story comes, I'm almost done. As I've said in these classes before, you're like, when's this guy going to be done? When you hear the duck story, we're almost at the end. I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and adopted by my own family. My mother and father adopted me from within the family. And I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia. I have a brother, 12 years older than me, so I was pretty much raised an only child. He graduated and left home at an early age, when I was early age. And my grandfather was a minister. He died at 102. He actually preached his 100th birthday sermon himself. When I was growing up, my faith, well, I didn't have faith at the beginning. Our family was not a faith family, except for my grandfather. He tried to get our family into the church, but my mom and dad really didn't want to go. I remember we used to go play cards at my uncle's house, and my father would say, "Don't tell your grandpa what we're doing." Because they would go and play nickel, dime, quarter, poker, and have a couple of adult beverages, and they would say that would upset grandpa because he doesn't like those kind of games. And that was true. Grandpa did not like those kind of games. My introduction to the religion, I was in the Boy Scouts, and as the church does, they have Scout Day, and they brought us in, and my whole family went, and that day, we all dedicated our lives to God, that got us into the church, and that got us in the door, and Grandpa's sermons, they finally hit home to my mother and father. I was probably 7 or 8 years old. We went to church there for a few years, and about 2 or 3 months into it, we got baptized at the Church of God. We got baptized into the Church of God. And at 8 years old, the only thing I could really think of was, you know, this is cool, my church has a pool. So, I really didn't I mean, I knew what it was, but I knew Jesus and I knew God, and my grandpa would preach those stories and tell me stories when I'd go to his house, and he was always planting that seed into my mind. And about 2 years later, my father became an ordained minister. So he got the calling, and he became an ordained minister. And you know, they were just expecting me to follow in line. I was next. Now, as a young boy, that was kind of hard because, well, at first it was good because I was the preacher's kid. Now, so I know how that is. I mean, everybody was coming to you and you know, just gathering around you as a preacher's kid. But my father took a job, or took his mission that he was the traveling priest or the traveling preacher for the church, and he would fill in for other ministers when they were on extended leave or they were sick. He would go in. So we went to now in West Virginia, churches have the word ridge, holler, or bottom in it. It's way out. So I would spend my Sundays as a 10, 11-year-old boy traveling with my father to these churches. And the youth group average age was about 70 years old. As I got older in high school, it became a little bit better because my father settled down into a normal routine at church. We had our own church. I got involved in the youth sports leagues at church and Christian athletic league, and that really helped out. And my father wasn't really a disciplinarian. I remember one time he had I had this hot wheel track that was that you hooked to the table, and I just found out what a person my father was, because he came home from work at the plant, the whistle would go off, and you know that 10 minutes later my father would walk through the door. And he came in one day and he said, "Get your racetrack off the table, we're getting ready to have dinner." And I made a really bad mistake. I said, "In just a minute." And he looked at me, and he grabbed that racetrack. He's like, "Here, I'll get it." And it came loose in a piece that was about that long, and the this yellow piece of plastic flipping around like Indiana Jones whip or something. And he looked at me, and that was my first crisis negotiation because I bladed myself back. And I said, look, no one needs to get hurt. Just wait and track. I said, just hand it over to me. Hand it over to me. I kind of bladed away, but I wasn't blading my gun away. I was blading my butt away because I knew where that cracked. And so that, I guess that was in my DNA to be a police officer from that moment on. Now, my grandfather was a coal miner. My father was a plant worker. And I was very emulous of their attitude and the way they treated people. But I knew that I did not want to emulate their job. I didn't want to be a coal miner. I didn't want to be a plant worker. I didn't want to be a pastor. I knew that. So in high school, we had the local police department come by. They did the shoot, don't shoot film. So I went through that. They said, we need a volunteer. So I jumped up. I was like, I'll do it. Much like I did here. I was like, oh, Frank, you need somebody, I'll do it. So I show up here, and they do the shoot, don't shoot film. Back then, it was the reel-to-reel. It wasn't the fancy laser like Steve's gonna have. It was actually a reel-to-reel film. They had to stop the film when the scene was over. And I did pretty well on this. So the officer, he took me over, he's like, can you come across the street to the police department after school? I was like, sure. So he gets me over there and he says, what are you gonna do when you graduate? I was like, I don't know, I'm gonna be a lawyer and maybe a marine biologist. I was like, no, you're not. He goes, let me show you something. He opens the phone book, he's like, look at all these lawyers. You don't want to do that. He goes, and marine biologist? That's not even in there. That's not even a thing. You don't want to do that. He said, you're going to be a cop. I'm like, okay, I'll be a cop. So I go to college, criminal justice system, and while I'm there, one of my professors says, hey, you guys get out and start taking some tests for these jobs, just to familiarize yourself with these police tests. So I took a few tests, a few of the municipal tests, a few of the civil service tests, to see what they're like. And there's an ad in the paper one day that says federal law enforcement. I was like, see what that's about. So I take the test, and a few months later I get a letter. First of all, I go into the test, and there's thousands of people in this city taking this test. And this test was like no test I've ever seen police work-wise. I mean, they were asking a sequence of numbers, and they were asking mathematical questions, and they were asking wires, which wire goes into which wire, and I was like, I just got to do with police work. Well, later on I found out the federal government has nothing to do with police work. Stephen, you can relate to that. So I take this test, and a few months later I get a letter saying, hey, you passed the test. Can you come in for an oral interview? We're going to have interviews set up at the Marriott. We'd like for you to come in. So I go in, and the questions they ask me, again, federal government has nothing to do with police work. They want to know about my loyalty to my country, my criminal record, my family history. So after that, a few months later, I get another letter from the Department of Defense. Congratulations, you passed the oral board, you passed the written test. We'd like for you to come to Fort Meade, Maryland for some physical agility testing and some medical testing. Sounds good. So I go. Well, that goes by. A couple months later, they say, hey, would you be interested in some more testing, some psychological testing, some more background investigation? Sure. So I go to that. Now I start getting letters from the Central Security Service. And it ends up, when I did finally get my job offer, I got a job offer from the National Security Agency as an investigator. I mean, I'm 20 years old, and they want me to be an investigator. So that shows how much confidence you have in your federal government. You have a 20-year-old college kid as an investigator. And one of their keys was they were going to pay for the rest of my college. So college is paid for, excellent. I graduate from FLETC, I graduate from the basic course, I graduate from the investigation course, I went to the advanced investigative techniques, and I went to NSA's course that they had. And then I get my assignment, and I'm investigating, I guess I can say this now, it's probably been declassified, so they wanted me to investigate incidences like missing classified documents that were at the agency. So we're missing a classified document, you need to go find it. Okay, it might be in this dumpster. All right. I was like, why don't we just set fire to the dumpster? Well, we're going to do that, but we need to make sure the document's in there first. So I spent about a year doing that, and then I got switched over to personnel. So then I was starting investigating people who didn't show up for work. You're not coming to work, you didn't call in. We need to know where you're at. You know all these secrets. We're going to send a couple guys out in suits and ties and black sunglasses and earpieces in a Suburban and track you down. Why you didn't come to work, why you didn't call. So I was thinking to myself, I was like, I spent all this time training as a police officer, and I'm digging around in dumpsters and following people around who didn't show up for work. So I take assignment, I walk past the message board, and it was really a message board. It was a board with messages on it back in those days. And I see overseas assignments available. So I see an assignment for Turkey, and all the numbers matched and all the codes and all my classifications, so I'm off to Turkey. Now, when I was in Turkey, I still didn't do any police work at all. That fell under the caveat of other assignments as the agency deems necessary. So while I'm there, I'm walking around, and I'm like, you know, I'm in Izmir, Turkey. Izmir, Turkey turns out to be Smyrna, Turkey, from the churches of the church of the Bible. And then I start looking, and I'm 10 miles from Ephesus. So I drive to Ephesus, and I start walking around, and I'm like, and it becomes real to me at that point. I'm like, you know, I said, I'm here. This is real. This is not a story that my grandpa's telling me. This is Ephesus. This is where Paul had the letter to the Ephesians. This is real. This is really nice. So this is awesome. So I've become a little more interested in the church again. Up till now, I've kind of lost my contact with my religion. And when it's there in front of me, I can actually reach out and touch the walls at the library of Ephesus, it got real again. So I started reading the Bible. Well, I want to know what the Bible says about Ephesus. I want to know what the Bible says about Smyrna. So I went back and I started reading the Bible. And I started looking for a church in Turkey. Now, there's not a whole lot of churches in Turkey, except for there was one church in Turkey, and it was a Catholic church, a French Catholic church. Unfortunately, I didn't speak French, but they had one service a week that was in English. So I started going to the Catholic church, and after some time and some consultation with the priest, I ended up being Catholic. Not to the pleasure of my father and my grandfather, who were Baptist ministers, because they didn't like the fact that I was worshiping the Pope now. So I'm in the heart of all this Christianity, and one day I'm sitting there, and here she came, walking down the street. I have a week on, week off at work, and here she came, walking down the street in a red dress, with the Aegean breeze blowing, and I'm looking at her, and she's got long blonde hair and long legs, and just the sun shining in her hair, and I was like, oh, this girl probably from Sweden or Germany, she probably doesn't speak any English at all. What am I going to do? I better get my dictionary out for whatever language she speaks, because I have to say something to this girl. She walks right up to me, and she says, are you an American? I'm a soldier, and I can't find the transition hotel. I was like, yes. Don't fall in love with this girl yet. She's not done with me. So a few years go by, or maybe a year goes by, and she tells me, I'm getting out of the military. I would like for you to move with me back to Spokane, Washington. All right, I'll do it. Now, my next assignment was supposed to be Brussels to Belgium. I was supposed to go to the Supreme Headquarters out of Private Europe and not be a cop there. So whatever they were going to make me do, I'm going to dig around in French fry pits or whatever they do in Belgium. So they had me sign for Belgium. I didn't make it. I got a compass out. My compass is a little thing with a pencil on it that you draw symbols with. And I set it to 100 miles. And I drew a circle, a 100-mile circle around Spokane, Washington, where my love of my life is from. And as I'm telling these stories, you probably think to yourself, I active listening that you've learned the last couple of days of when this guy could have used a chaplain. Because one of those instances is about ready to come home. So I draw this 100-mile circle around, and I send resumes to every department around a 100-mile circle. This small department in Moscow, Idaho, which is exactly where Frank's daughter just graduated from school, ironically. Sends me a letter back. Says, we're very interested in your application. You've got federal law enforcement training. We'd like to meet you. We'd like to tentatively offer you a job. And I go and meet with the sheriff, which took forever because I had to take a military flight from Europe to Asia to the States and Canada and then back to Europe, and then you know how the military goes. So about the 3 days it took me to get there, I meet the sheriff, and he is a retired colonel from military intelligence, and as soon as I tell him I work for a national security agency, he hired me on the spot. He's like, oh, you're hired. I was like, okay, cool. So I still haven't been a cop. I've got all this training, I haven't been able to be a cop yet. I'm just chomping at the bit. I'm like, all right, finally, I'm going to be a cop. I'm going to be a deputy sheriff in Idaho. I've got the love of my life coming to meet me. We're going to live happily ever after. Well, 2 days after I arrive in Idaho, I get a phone call. And it's the love of my life. And she says, I don't know how to say this, but I'm going to re-enlist and go to Germany. So, here's where you guys come in. Because I needed to right then. And I'm thinking to myself, it's like, well, I don't really know anybody in Idaho. And when I got there, all I had was a motorcycle and a duffel bag full of clothes that I drove about 6 hours from the airport, because that's how long it takes to drive on a motorcycle in April in Idaho. I had no idea how cold it was in April in Idaho, but I found out. But people thought I was a badass riding a motorcycle in the town in the middle of the winter, I tell you. So, I get to Idaho and she makes that phone call. I've got some decisions to make now. I'm like, well, what do I do? Do I go back and beg for my job back in the National Security Agency? Because I know my days of Belgium and Turkey are over. I'm probably going to get Idaho and Washington in the middle of the desert, or in Yuma, Arizona in the middle of the desert. It's not going to be a glamorous assignment, I know. Or I've got my duffel bag and a gun. I can go on a crime spree. That was an option. Or I could just stick it out. So I decided I'm going to show her. I'm going to stick it out. And Frank was saying that the stress gets to you. So my decision was to stick it out, and I'm just going to victimize every girl I date now. I'm not trusting anybody from now on. My days of trust with women are over, and I'm done with that. So I make the decision to stay, and my first couple of days in Idaho, I get all my equipment issued in April, so it's pouring the rain in Idaho, and they have this concert out in the middle of a wheat field. And the only way we could get to it was horseback or four-wheeler. So we take our horses and our four-wheelers out to this concert, and the sheriff comes to me and he's like, you know how to ride a horse? Yeah. He didn't ask me, do I know how to saddle a horse? Because the answer to that was no, I did not know how to saddle a horse. I learned, but I did not know. I couldn't just Google it. YouTube back then, I was like, yeah, sure, yeah, I can ride a horse. As long as somebody saddles it for me and lifts me up on it. And so I get out there, and I'm out in the middle of this field in a pouring rainstorm. I've got my Stetson hat on, and I've got my oil slicker long coat on, and I've got my gun, and I've got my cowboy boots and my jeans. I'm looking around, and I say, you know what? I'm still not a cop. I'm a cowboy. So all I had to be was a cop. I've been a spy, and I've been a cowboy so far. I haven't done anything cop-wise. So in Idaho, that was nice, kind of some isolated incidents. We were cowboys out there, but it was isolated, and we did a lot of good stuff, and a lot of I had patrol, I worked SWAT, and hostage negotiation school. I got to go to the FBI Academy, go to hostage negotiation school. I was a detective, field training officer, and eventually I made it up to Patrol Supervisor. Well, one day, we're working the patrol, and I have my squad in, and we're doing a briefing, and the sheriff walks in, and he says, Sergeant King, this is Gary Young. He's the new chaplain. He's my friend, and he's going to be our new chaplain. And he's going to ride along with you. And we all just kind of looked at Gary. We're like, okay, this is new. The sheriff must have been reading one of his sheriff's magazines, Sheriff's Chaplain. What is that? Because in my day, if it didn't happen on Columbo, Chips, Starsky and Hutch, or Hill Street Blues, it wasn't police.
Car 54.
Yeah, Car 54. So we had this new chaplain, and the only thing Gary had going for him at that time was he was about 6'8", and he was standing there, and I thought to myself, I was like, we're going to slap a uniform on him and pretend he's a deputy. So that's what we'll do. So Gary kind of came into the program, and he would come into briefing, and as soon as he got to briefing, man, the guys were out the door. They're like, they didn't want anything to do with Gary Young and this chaplain program. So old Sarge got stuck with Gary every time Gary showed up. Those guys would clear out. I mean, I couldn't force them to do a call early, but as soon as they saw Gary coming or pointing in the parking lot, oh, we're on our way to that call. We're on our way. We'll take care of that. We'll take care of that. They were gone. So they had nothing to do with Gary. So Gary's riding around with me one night. And he says, you know what? He goes, the sheriff asked me the other night what the guy's thinking. I just looked over at him and was like, why don't you tell him? He's like, well, I told him that none of his business. I'm not here to report on what the guys think. I'm here to help the guys, and I'm not going to tell you anything they say in this car, Joe. I was like, okay. Well, Gary might not be so bad after all. After all, the sheriff already had a bunch of people telling him what everybody was saying anyway. He didn't need Gary to do it. Gary kind of became my partner. I mean, I started taking Gary along with me on rides, and Gary and I, every time Gary would come, I was like, oh, I got Gary. I'll take Gary. He's coming with me. So Gary rode with me a lot. And one night, one of the guys says to me, he's like, hey, how come you're always riding with Gary? I told him the story about what Gary said about the sheriff. He's like, really? And I saw the wheels start turning in his head. And Gary was a great guy. He would invite me to his house for Thanksgiving dinner, and the guys would see me going over there. One night, one of the guys comes to me, he's like, hey, you mind if Gary rides with me tonight? I was like, sure. Yeah, Gary ride with you anytime you want. So I found out later the reason that Gary rode with that guy. The officer told me that Gary helped him out because he ended up having an affair with his wife, and they were getting ready to get divorced, and they were having a lot of problems, and he started looking at some pornography, and he confided in Gary, and Gary took care of him. Gary gave him guidance, and Gary was there for him, and that went from me, that officer, and down the line. So now all these guys are starting to say, hey, I can talk to this guy, and he's not going to say anything to anybody. So all of a sudden, now we need more chaplains because we have more guys with problems, and we need more chaplains. So Gary went out and recruited 3 or 4 more chaplains. So the size of our office in Idaho, we had probably a chaplain corps of 5. We probably had 5 chaplains at that time. So that started our program in Lake Hall County, and it was a great program, and it really worked out. And it's active to this day. Actually, one of the guys that was one of them back then is in charge of it now. So I took my leave from Gary and kind of passed him off to the other guys. Gary would drive me every once in a while and ask me how I'm doing. I really appreciated that. I went to meth lab school at Quantico after that. Shortly thereafter, I was a detective, and one of the sheriff came in and he said, I'd like you to go to the drug task force. We're handing all these cases over. We're starting cases that you're starting, and then we're handing them off, and they're getting credit for it. And he said, I'm an elected official. I need the credit for it. I was like, makes sense to me. So I go to the drug task force commander, and I said, I'm a pretty decent detective, but I don't know if I can do drug crimes. It says to me, and he's like, well, drug crimes are the easiest crimes to do, because now you're doing a crime, and you have a rape or a robbery or a burglary, and you have to figure out who did it. So with drug crimes, you know who did it, you just have to figure out what they did. Which made perfect sense to me. I'm like, well, okay, I'll do it. So I went to the Quad Cities Drug Task Force, and I got linked up with some guys over on the west coast of Washington, and I ended up transferring over to Federal Way Police Department. Federal Way is a lot higher paid than Idaho, which, you know, you'll find out that a lot of us are just blue mercenaries. And we go where the money is. If you're doing the same thing, I mean, if you're going to do it here for X amount, you might as well do it somewhere else for double that. So I moved over to Federal Way, Washington. There I was on patrol. I did bikes, mountain bikes. I did shift commander stuff. I did some academy instruction work. Part of my academy instruction work, I was a instructor in ground fighting and weapon retention. That was my thing. I love teaching that. We hired several officers from Honolulu Police Department at one point. Again, for the pay, we went over to Honolulu. Well, I'm sure one of the lieutenants or the deputy chief or somebody had an idea to go to Honolulu to recruit people. I wasn't invited on that trip. We hired a bunch of those guys, and those guys, when we got them back, we noticed that their officer safety wasn't the greatest in the world. So we picked a few of them out that we noticed their officer safety was just a little lacking. And we're going to send them to some extra training. Some of my training, some of the ground fighting, some of the weapon retention. And there was a gentleman by the name of Patrick Moore. And Pat was on my shift. And at the end of the shift, one night they called us and they said, you know, we need somebody to stay over for day shift for 5 hours. And the way we did our day shift with our absent officer coverage, we'd have somebody from the previous shift stay 5 hours extra, and we'd call somebody from the next shift in 5 hours or to cover the 10-hour shift. So you only had to work half a shift. Well, as police officers do, when they call that out, all the senior officers make a police-related law enforcement decision, and we say not yet. So Pat got stuck. He was going to get stuck anyway because he was the senior. He was a junior officer. Now Pat was getting ready to go back on shift, and I've been teasing him all week. And Pat was standing in his locker. I shoved him from behind. I said to him, I said, "Hey, you'll be hurt tonight, because I'm going to kick your ass Monday morning and teach you how to fight." So at 10:20 a.m. that morning, Pat's on a call at the AM PM at 272nd and Highway 99, which we call the line, because it was right on the Federal Way Kent City line. Pat started taking a credit card call or fraudulent use of the credit card call. He looks outside and he sees a fight going on. So Pat jumps outside, says, "Hey, break up the fight." And one of the guys takes off running. And you just don't do that. You don't run from the police. That's contempt of an officer, and we're going to chase you. Even though we don't know what you did, we're going to chase you. So Pat chases the guy, and he goes across the street into a tire shop area, the yard behind the tire shop. Pat chased him over there, and there was a fence, and the guy had nowhere to go, so he turned back, and Pat was coming. So they met and got into a physical altercation. Pat's trying to arrest him, and Pat's, for all we can figure, is Pat must have unsnapped his gun as he was chasing him, or didn't have a snap to start with. As he's running across the street, when he meets up with this guy, the gun comes out, and the guy's got the gun. The suspect has the gun. Well, here comes the other two people in the fight. It ended up being the suspect's brother and his girlfriend. So he's not going to shoot Pat, but he's going to shoot his brother. So he tries to take Pat's gun and aim it at his brother. Pat grabs a gun, pushes down on it. They're fighting over the gun. And we had Glocks, so even if you disengage the magazine, the trigger round's going to go off. So the guy's aiming the gun at his brother, and Pat kind of brings it around, and he tried to do some things that we taught him. If the gun's going to go off, we want it to either go off in the air, down the ground, but if it's going to go off on you, at least try to get it in that trauma plate so it hits your trauma plate and you're going to have a little bit more chance to survive. The gun got pushed down right at the moment that it went off, and it went off in Pat's hip, right below his vest. Pat goes down, call goes out, Pat's radio is in a vertical position, so his emergency button goes off, and they got to Pat. Well, first of all, one of the workers from the store comes out and sees what's going on. He takes a tire and he clocks the guy over the head and knocks him out cold. A couple people jump on him, and they got the guy right there on the scene. So he didn't get away. They caught him. And Pat, about an hour and a half, 2 hours later, I guess inside your hip there are just thousands of these little tiny holes with veins and arteries going through them. And they couldn't get the bleeding stopped. Pat died. And the last thing that I said to him was, "Don't get hurt." And I blame myself for years for that. And I know it's not my fault, but you couldn't have told me that. We didn't have a chaplain program. Nobody told us. Nobody told me it wasn't my fault. I convinced myself that I should have been working that night. I would be alive. That guy would be beaten and bruised for trying to take my gun because that's what I do. And I teach that class. I'm the guy that I'm the last guy you're going to try to take a gun from, because I would break you in half. And I have no qualms. I'm going to sleep like a baby. But Pat, he didn't get a chance to learn that. The suspect, Jason Scott Roberts, pled guilty, not to first-degree murder, but to lesser included offense, and he got 30 years. So I'm figuring with good time, they couldn't prove he was premeditated, which is true. It wasn't a premeditated murder, but it was a murder of an officer in the line of duty. It should have been felony first-degree murder. But in Washington State, that wasn't like that. They pled guilty to something lesser. He got 30 years, so day for day time, he's going to get out next year. So he'll be walking the streets again next year. Pat was at Federal Way for 7 months before he died. He was at Honolulu Police Department for 7 years. He was a 20-year veteran with the U.S. Coast Guard. He had a wife and 3 children. 5 months to the day that Pat died, his oldest son got killed in a car wreck. So the mother, I can't even imagine what the mother went through. Now the duck. So we have no chaplain program, no peace officer ministry showing up for us, no way to decompress. We're just going to go out and kick ass and take names. And the criminals are going to be afraid. The citizens are going to be afraid. We're just going to exact our revenge on everybody for the murder of our friend. Which is what the public thought. We would go on calls of normal calls of people that we dealt with every day after that. And you would see the normal calls that we would deal with, the repeat offenders, we call them. They would open the door and see the police, and you'd see them start shaking because they knew something was coming, something bad was going to happen to them if they even stepped out of line. So after we get Pat in the ground and buried, and that's what we were expected to do, bury your comrade, say your goodbyes, and get back to work. We had no way to decompress. We did decompress one night after that, but it didn't help because we just went out and drank and told stories and made it worse, I think. We didn't have a healthy way to decompress. So I'm on my way home. I'm on the honor guard because I'm on Pat's shift. And you guys laugh at my duck story. I don't care. It's just kind of silly. I'm on my way home from the funeral. And I have my shiny Sam Brown belt on and my starch, Class A jacket and my shiny shoes and my shiny hat and my white gloves up in my elbows. I'm coming home. I'm in my Jeep. I've got the top off. I've got my music blaring. I'm just thinking about everything that happened. By this senseless murder of a guy by a suspect who wasn't even going to get arrested. Pat wasn't even. The guy did absolutely nothing that he can be arrested for. So Pat's murder was completely senseless. So I'm driving home, and I come come around the corner, and I live in Seattle, so I live between the ocean, and I live on a lake. And I'm coming home, and I go around the corner, and at the last minute, this duck comes out in front of me, and I hit the duck. And it's laying in the road, and I stop, I slam on the brakes, and I get out, and I look back there, and this little duck's head's coming up and flopping back down. I'm like, what else? Like, I just can't handle this. I was like, it's enough death. No more death. I pick up the duck, and his little head just flops over in my hands, and he dies in my arms. And I started bawling. I mean, I was just unconsolable. I was bawling, crying, and I was sobbing. I finally got a little bit of composure, and I put the duck in the back of my car. I drive it back to my house, and I get over to my house, and I'm like, oh, what am I going to do? I'm an awful person. My friend's dead because of me. I said something horrible to him. The last thing I said to him was, don't get hurt. Now I've killed this duck because I wasn't paying attention to what I'm doing. So I get the duck, and I've got my Class A uniform on. And I got the duck in my hand, and I got his head, and I'm resting his head. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to do some of this duck. So I'm like, this is a nice place for a burial. I'm gonna take him over to the edge of the lake. I'm gonna lay him to rest. So I've got this duck, and I'm walking with a purpose. I've got my hat on and my gloves, and I'm pretty much walking at present duck around this lake. And I get over there, and I dig the hole, and I dig a nice square hole. I'm sure if there was some kind of manual on how to dig a duck's grave, that would be. I wrote the manual on how to dig a duck's grave to military standards. So I dig this, 2 foot by 2 foot hole, and I measure down, I put the duck in it, I take my little white gloves, and I'm like, rest in peace, little duck. And I put my white gloves on him, and I bury him, I shove him, I take a little rock, and I make a little headstone for him, and I salute him. And I actually did a military facing movement and walked away. And I'm sure the neighbors are looking out saying, hey, that handsome police officer across the street has lost his mind. But I haven't, that's not the craziest part. So I get back to the house, and I take my stuff off, and I throw it in the corner because I'm mad, and I throw all my stuff over, and I put my shorts on and my t-shirt, and I get my bag chair, and I'm like, I'm going to drink some beer out in the yard. So I go out there, and I start thinking, I was like, there's raccoons all over the place out here. It's probably over there digging up my little duck finger right now. So I get my bag chair, and I'm like, I'm going to go on vigil. So I go to the duck's gravesite, and I set my chair up. I've got my 6-pack of beer and my gun. And I sat there all night drinking this 6-pack of beer with this gun and my bag chair, watching vigil over the tomb of the unknown duck. And then finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was like, well, that's enough of that. I'm going to bed. So I went in, and I said the neighbors were like, I'm surprised I didn't get a call on me for the police to show up, because there's a guy out there with a gun drinking beer standing over a duck's grave. So I make my way back, and you guys are laughing at that grown man crying. So I made my way back to West Virginia. I've had enough police work. I made my way back to West Virginia. Like Frank said, my wife and I, one day we need to find a church, because I'm starting to get back into religion again. I know that I have something missing in my life, and I need God in my life. And I get one morning, we kind of had a talk, my wife and I. Was like, okay, you're Baptist, I've been Baptist, or grown up in the Church of God, in Baptist churches. I'm Catholic now, so I did a little religious math. I said, if you add a Catholic and a Baptist, you get a Lutheran. So we're going to go check this out. So at our house, in Charleston, there's two Lutheran churches about 2 miles apart from each other. I didn't understand that at the time. So I looked in the internet, and I said, okay, this church starts at 10:30, and Redeemer Church starts at 10:45. So we leave the house on time. We want to be there early for the 10:30 church, for St. Timothy's. We're heading there. Red light. Another red light. Another red light. Traffic problems. Train on the track. Like, go to this Redeemer church now. So 15-minute difference is what got me to Frank. We pull in, and I walk through the door, and Frank's in there, and like Frank said, he looked at me and said that. I looked at my wife and I said, look at that guy, he's got a cop mustache. And then I see Frank up there, and when he goes up to deliver Frank's routine is he goes up and he does the procession, and he has announcements. And while he's doing the announcements, he does this. That's called a cop walk. I told my wife, I said, look, he's doing a cop thing again. He's doing a rock, like the rock when we're talking to somebody. And then I said, look at his wristwatch. Frank wears his wristwatch upside down. I said, only cops do that. I said, this guy is like the worst undercover cop I've ever seen. I said, how's he undercover as a Lutheran minister? I was like, I don't get it. So after church, Frank comes over. He gives me the police officer ministry Bible, and I read the introduction, and I learned what a tool Frank was, and he wrote about it. So I was kind of. And when I'm at that church, I feel like I'm home, and Frank has made that possible. Frank's guidance. Doug's story has an ending, has a happy ending, because I told Frank that story one day. Just Frank and I were in there, and I said, Frank, let me think about this Doug. So I told Frank the Doug story that I told you, and he said, well, he goes, you know what? He goes, maybe that was just God's way of giving you a release to let you cry. Because the whole time during the funeral service, when Pat got killed, I didn't shed a tear. As soon as I killed that Doug, the tears just flowed and flowed and flowed. And it just took somebody from outside to see that, to tell me that that's why things happen. God has control over everything in your life. And I wasn't releasing that to God. I wasn't crying. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't coping with my friend's death. I was blaming myself. I was blaming everybody else but the guy who did it. And if I would have had a chaplain there, maybe he would have told me that, and it could have saved me a lot of years of pain and anguish. And I just thank God for